If you use the internet nearly as much as I do, then you've probably seen the countless reels, posts and YouTube videos about the fruttiger aesthetic that dominated the world of technology, advertising, video games and other forms of media alike, from roughly 2004 to 2013. I personally first heard of this term in late 2022, and it seems that this year, 20 years after its breakthrough, has seen a massive surge in its popularity amongst online creators, who seem to note how fun and enticing this consumer aesthetic is, with its use of three-dimensional graphics, nature and futurism, in comparison to the modern, flat, minimalist approach that corporations seem to have adopted within the past decade. However, very recently I've noticed that styles, aesthetics and pop culture traditions from the 2000s are making a return. But why is this? The early 2000s saw a rapid increase in technological advancement. Society began using the internet more and more, increasing the interactivity of online spaces, leading to what we now know as the Web 2.0. This proved that the internet can evolve over time and become more of a community, where users can find themselves using the web more frequently. The decade also saw the development of smartphones, something that combined separate, more analog technologies of the past into one digital device. The fact that a large proportion of the audience for smartphones wouldn't understand how to use this new technology, paired with the accelerating development of computer graphics, led to this brand new look, adopted by early Apple iOS and Android versions, and operating systems such as Windows 7. This can be characterised by its use of skeuomorphism, essentially using familiar images of older analog technology for things that carry out similar functions, so like having the camera app look like an actual camera, and the Gmail app looking like a little envelope, or the Notes app being a notepad. Images of nature and humanism were adopted, creating a bright virtual utopia to invite and welcome new users of this rapidly advancing technology. However, as the general population got used to how the internet and smartphone operating systems worked, this element of design was no longer needed, and by the mid-2010s was becoming older and more dated, slowly associated with an era which was now futile and obsolete, and there was enough creative room for other styles to dominate these spaces. This is where the flat and minimalist approach of graphic design found its footing, and it was only a matter of time until those exact same user interfaces, alongside marketing and wider media, would take on that aesthetic. For someone in a generation that grew up very young, constantly seeing bright, fun, three-dimensional designs, suddenly being stuck in a world full of none of this distinct character would leave you longing for what came before, despite it being old and relatively pointless. This would soon become the case for many, potentially leading to a consensus between online users that belong to this generation, looking for this look to resurface. This can be seen both in a discourse around 2000 aesthetics on TikTok and YouTube alike, but can be seen in modern UI interfaces in the form of neomorphism, basically a mix between flat minimalism and the 3D design that came before, seen in recent releases like Windows 11, the App Store, and the new Android logo and even Reddit logo. Perhaps we realised minimalism was boring, and that whilst skeuomorphism was of its time, it could still be implemented into something that is profound and new. While the everyday, more corporate design angle might reek of an older way of life begging to be brought back, we can actually see proof of the rituals of the 2000s coming back in the form of pop culture as well. The decade began with the youth of the time being infatuated with the cinematic utopia of the late 20th century being diverted, with major film studios starting new franchises, which garnered much more of a fan base than ever before. Sony's new Spider-Man trilogy paved the way for not only a whole cinematic universe to take effect, but also led to multiple iterations of the role decades later. The Star Wars prequel trilogy initially angered the likes of Tim Bisley by not recapturing the magical essence of the original 3 films, but managed to develop a following with the youth at the time, who grew up with the prequels and the Clone Wars, which started in 2008. In the world of popular television, Doctor Who was brought back in 2005 after being off the air for 16 years, with a more modern setting and in a series which was laid out to be more accessible to the 21st century audience. The first few series managed to accumulate over 13 million viewers for some episodes. Going into the 2010s, however, this cultural renaissance seemed to stagnate. To use our three examples again, there were 2 new Spider-Men in the space of 6 years, the Star Wars sequels were released, to this time pretty much universal disapproval, and Doctor Who was slightly falling out of popularity for most of the public, with an average of 7.5 million viewers in 2007 to an average of 5.5 million 10 years later in 2017. Which is still good, by the way, just not as incredibly popular as it was in the early days of the show's revival. But something seemed to happen in the dawn of the 2020s. Tobey Maguire was brought back for Spider-Man No Way Home, Ewan McGregor was brought back as Obi-Wan Kenobi for his own Disney Plus series, Clone Wars characters were introduced in The Mandalorian, and David Tennant was brought back in the leading role for Doctor Who's 60th anniversary. This is all really exciting, but it poses the question, is this all for the sake of nostalgia? Is entertainment just boiling down to the point where almost every new massive release just exists to please the generation that came before and bring back good memories of their youth? Well, what if I told you that to remain popular, then certain mass media corporations might feel a necessity to bring back what came 20 years before? The 20-year nostalgia cycle, or the 20-year rule, is something that has been briefly discussed on the internet, something which has been used to explain the re-emergence of these elements of the 2000s, that essentially states that, as a collective, we enjoy mass media trends that existed 20 years ago, and will do so 20 years from now, and so on and so on. If we want to apply this theory to some of the things we've already discussed, then we can map it out like this. We start with the year 0, in this case it's around 2004. This is the cultural renewal period, as it's when the most popular franchises that seem to brand everyone's childhoods emerge. These media trends become dominant and widespread, and last all the way until the mid-2010s. We'll call this the dominant period, ending around 2014, or year 10 on this map. Then, cultural trends slow down and start to become dormant in the mid to late 2010s, from year 10 to around year 16, and we'll call this the hollow period. The cultural renewal happens between year 17 and year 20, or between 2021 and 2024. This leaves us where we are now, with graphics and advertising trends coming back and pop culture from 20 years ago being revisited. Culture renews itself in year 0, or year 20, and becomes the norm for a few years after that, before fading out. Then, the generation who has vague memories of that dominant period starts discourse about the way things were then, and people start to reminisce about year 1 to 9, and is brought back into popularity. This explains why trends like the vaporwave genre started in the early 2010s, as a musical style and visual aesthetic that sampled the sound and replicated the look of the late 80s and early to mid 90s. It was incredibly popular online before the 2020s rolled around, and the vaporwave era was no longer 20 years old. So the popular trend amongst internet users obsessed with vibes culture moved on to that of the 2000s, and the Fruitiger Aero craze was born. So there you go, that's why the 2000s are back 20 years from its prime, except that's not quite it. If this 20-year nostalgia cycle really was in effect, then the culture that we all know and love from the 2000s must be a cultural renewal of that of the 1980s, and that must be a renewal of the 60s, which must be a renewal of the 40s, and so on. But when you examine the skeuomorphic and corporate design elements of the 2000s, then it's clear that they're a separate entity from anything that came before. It's simply a projection of the future, a welcoming visual utopia designed to welcome consumers to a new world with a rapidly evolving new medium, the internet. 20 years before that, in the 1980s, we saw the introduction of Memphis design, and aesthetics that we would later classify as synthwave or outrun. These were incredibly modern and at times presented a cool, neon-plaid utopic future, but contained in the technology and media of the time. There was no Web 2.0 to promote, only music, television and cinema alongside other mainstream media of the era. If we go back another 20 years, we can look at the use of atom punk and ray gun gothic vibes that again present a vision of the future, but through the lens of the public consensus and zeitgeist of the time. A society constantly on the edge of the threat of nuclear war, a patriotic society surviving off of the belief that Western capitalist civilization will prevail, and a society that had recently seen the advent of early science fiction, who were naive enough to rejoice in the belief that this is what the future would look like. Fruitiger Aero is just a version of this, but from the era where society was facing a different advent, the advent of connectivity online. The difference is that consumers in the 2000s had seen the reality of the latter part of the 20th century pan out. So the only thing we had left to be naive about was this brand new world that connected us all, the World Wide Web. This trend has proven to repeat itself, so it poses a new question: why aren't we seeing a version of this now? Instead of seeing a brand new futuristic humanist corporate aesthetic, we in the 2020s are only graced with a mix of looks which we had before. Perhaps there is no massive form of media that needs to be promoted, and user interactivity on the internet has reached its highest point, where we as the current generation are the opposite of naive. We are so experienced to the point of mundanity. We can connect to the outside world and learn about what came before. Someone incredibly young can learn about fashion, music, art, cinema and technology from 20, 40 or 60 years ago, and it culminates in a cultural climate that we've never seen before, where individuals can adopt fashion, music tastes and aesthetics of the past. It also, however, shows us that members of the current generation can also indulge in the vibes culture trend. They can explore the countless labels given by other internet users to past aesthetics, and can learn that in the past, we have continuously tried to present a false hope, a promising future to try and entice consumers onto the next great trend, and can learn that every single time, that future has not come to be. It's only with the connectivity of the internet that we've come to the point where it has become pointless to entice consumers with a brand new utopia, as those very consumers know that it's all a corporate lie. And the 20-year cycle hasn't been broken, but has changed, from us being clueless of what came before to taking what has come before and celebrating it, making it something everyone can reminisce on and turning it into something shiny and new.